everyone. Welcome back. This is the second episode of this series, which Dr. Merdad Alipour and myself are discussing a number of highly sensitive topics concerning Islamic law and ethical standpoint concerning sex, gender, and sexuality. In the first episode, after introducing ourselves, we briefly elaborated on our goals in the production of these podcasts, and today we will try to further advance the discussion. So how can our debates be discerned from the previous scholarships on this matter, and also go beyond it, in particular from a methodological point of view? We know that the topics of modern sexuality, sex, and gender have been discussed by reformist and feminist Muslim scholars for decades now.
Yes, very true. In fact, Muslim feminists, reformists, or as sometimes they would like to be called, progressive, pioneered debating these topics from the Islamic points of view, which are truly appealing. So we should delineate our position on this matter and explicate our contribution to the existing scholarship. But there is also another crucial point which must not slip our minds. By that, I mean any Muslim scholar who engage with such awfully sensitive topics should have other reasons beyond purely academic research. Therefore, each scholarship should also be evaluated based on its positive impact on Muslim LGBTQI+ communities as well as Muslim community at large. So returning to your question, currently there are four major methodological attitudes to study gender, sex, and sexuality from within Islamic textual and revelational tradition. The first approach, which I call it traditional or neo-traditional approach, in this attitude, the scholars try to preserve the received traditional scholarship from prominent historical Islamic figures and apply them to modern issues, including modern phenomena relating to gender, sex, or sexuality. This often happens without delving into the internal logic of the historical and classical discourses and their relationships with modern issues. This approach is common in Islamic seminaries or madrasas, whether it's Sunni or Shia. Also, several Muslim scholars or imams in the West follow the same route. For instance, in the case of homosexuality, Abdul Hakim Murad is a good example of an imam, an Islamic scholar who applies this attitude. Interestingly, sometimes this approach overlaps with Orientalism. For example, in the case of intersex topics and the way in which they try to reduce human categories to only men and women by asserting that Islam never tolerates non-binary articulation of humanity. We'll hopefully elaborate on this issue in another podcast concerning intersex issues. The second methodological approach is historical textual approach, which mainly Orientalists who pretend that they purely interpret Islamic tradition from within its textual sources or other materials available. However, thanks mainly to Edward Said, we now know that this claim is not accurate, and Orientalists were pretty much either biased in their studies, both collectively and selectively, or if being optimistic, ignorant due to the lack of lived experience and inability to understand and empathize with the spirit of Islamic traditions and cultures. And the third attitude, I would call it Muslim reformist approach. So this methodology is inspired by feminist scholarship and their successful critical observations on the patriarchal reading of religions. So Muslim reformist scholars who have conducted studies on these topics have mostly based their research on feminist critical epistemology and modern hermeneutics. So this approach is also partly grounded in several other theological and scientific principles, such as Islamic liberation theology, presented by Farid Ishaq, and Islamic diversity, advocated by Khalid Abu al-Fazl.
Sorry to interrupt you. Before we continue, let me briefly explain these two principles to those who might not be familiar with them. The essence of liberation theology in general is to support oppressed groups and stand against all forms of oppression. all forms of injustice, violence, and discrimination. So in the Islamic context, any textual revelation or understanding of the Islamic tradition, namely the Quran and the Sunnah, that allows or permits discrimination or unjust behavior against any other Muslim individuals or groups is not authentic and reliable for Muslims. And according to reformist commentary of the Quran, such as Khalid Abu al-Fadl, the Quran can be used by Muslims to easily defend an ethical diversity and tolerance as a primary purpose of creation. So the concept of Islamic liberation theology is always interwoven and is very much linked to the question of justice. I just wanted to clarify that for those who were not familiar with the principles that you mentioned. But
yes, thank you. But there is still another principle used by this approach, which can be categorized as the cohesion between Islam and scientific achievements. This is a significant principle that some reformist Muslims apply to interpret the Quran, according to which Quranic verses should cohere with scientific observations or explanations. And finally, there is the last methodological approach is a new synthetic approach to debate gender and sexuality in Islam, which I myself strongly support. This type of a scholarship shed light at this discourse by utilizing both traditional ulama's methodology, or repertoires, if you wish, and by reflecting on the genealogy of modern phenomena concerning sex, gender, and sexuality. It also compares and contrasts these modern topics with the pre-modern categories that existed in Islamic cultures and societies. And finally, through such comparative studies, comes to its concluding remarks.
Before further delving into this approach, which to my knowledge, you are one of the pioneering scholars, I would like to know why, one, even need to bring such a new perspective to the debate in the first place. I'm saying this because examining Islamical approaches to new arising issues through the lenses of modern disciplines such as epistemology, hermeneutics, scientific outputs, and feminist critical theory, as Muslim reformers and feminists observed and employed, is apparently successful. And I believe it would theoretically result in a more tolerant or accepting views towards sexual and gender diversity in Islam.
I agree with you that Muslim reformist point of view theoretically might result in a more tolerant or even acceptant approach to sexual or gender diversity. However, it is not necessarily more practical or successful in fostering a constructive dialogue between reformists and traditional ulama on modern topics. In fact, reality shows otherwise. I mean, ulama strongly try to keep the distance from reformist or reformist scholarships. And I believe that by losing ulama's trust, one essentially fails to find the agreement and empathy of Muslim communities at large, as well as many traditionally faithful members of the LGBTQI+ communities.
But then again, while you admire the works of scholars who have investigated gender and sexuality related issues in Islam from such a modern perspective, you do not follow their path. Do you prefer to disregard such modern scholarship in favor of traditional ulama approach?
Oh, no, that is not about inclining to one group over another. I don't pursue this path because the studies which advocate the idea of cohesion between Islam and sexuality or gender diversity too often discuss this issue solely from the Quranic perspective, and they rarely touch upon Sunnah. And by Sunnah, I mean sayings, deeds, and endorsements of the Prophet Muhammad in Sunni tradition and of Prophet, his daughter Fatima, and the two of Imams in Shia context. Another point which makes me not follow this scholarship is that these studies do not seem to be keen on debating the rational and ethical arguments that traditional or neo-traditional Muslims provide against homosexuality or non-binary sex or gender. More importantly, this approach appears to be inappropriate or inapplicable, at least for the purpose of my project, which aims to explore the discursive spaces for negotiating sex, gender, and sexual diversity from within Islamic legal and ethical system.
Let us focus on this point a bit more then. I'm still not fully convinced that in order to have a successful outcome on sexual and gender diversity in Islam, that Muslim reformers and feminists should open a constructive dialogue with traditional ulama, who are often very conservative.
Yeah, I see your point. However, to my understanding, one of the main purpose of the scholars who engage with such sensitive topics is or should be to ultimately support LGBTQI minority groups and individuals living in Muslim societies or communities. So to achieve this goal, it is, I believe, essential to utilize the repertoires of Muslim traditional scholars in support of this agenda. This might happen first and foremost through constantly open dialogues between reformist and traditional scholars. However, Muslim reformist approach, in my view, not only does not facilitate such a dialogue, but also blocks potential path for such collaborations between reformists and traditional scholars by generating a number of barriers.
Can you give us an example of what these barriers are?
Yes, of course. I will outline three of these barriers. The first barrier I call the language problem. Modern approaches to sexual diversity in Islam generally apply technical languages to this discourse, which have been produced and adapted by activists and scholars of gender and sexuality studies in the West. These languages are far from the traditional scholars' terminology. Therefore, using modern technical terminologies might prevent any potential dialogues between reformists and traditional scholars. As such, it is necessary for reformist scholars to seek a shared language with traditional Muslim on this issue to provide a common ground for understanding modern sexuality and gender debates and their differentiations from pre-modern categories. As I mentioned earlier, we should not forget that this scholarship, after all, is being conducted to support LGBTQI individuals living in Muslim societies. This goal would less likely be achieved without positive collaborations between reformist scholars and traditional jurists. The second barrier concerns the reformist methodology. That means the methodology that these reformists use to discuss these topics, commonly based on modern scientific tools, hermeneutics, and feminist critical approaches, all of which are seemingly unknown to traditional scholars. Therefore, the reliability of the reformist whole project on sexuality and gender diversity in Islam can easily be suspected by these scholars, as they do not find modern methodologies authentic for understanding or driving Islamic law. In traditional scholars' view, there are valid methodologies which should be employed. For example, according to the majority of traditional Muslim scholars, ijtihad is an authentic method to interpret Islamic text and drive Islamic laws from the original sources. Any scholarship not using this methodology, in their view, does not have validity. Therefore, the use of modern methodologies supplies the traditional jurists with firm grounds to believe that reformist understanding of Islam is unreliable, as it is not grounded by the methodology of ijtihad. Finally, it seems that reformist scholars mostly undermine the potentiality of applying traditional discourses, both the language and methodology, to understanding Islamic traditions, teachings, and laws in a non-patriarchal form. However, regardless of the drawbacks that traditional methodology might have, and I believe in that, there are, in my view, pathway or repertoires in this methodology whereby one can foster different discourses and thus advocate alternative, non-patriarchal Islamic approaches to modern issues such as homosexuality. For example, Ayatollah Khomeini's fatwa on the topic of transgender, gender-confirming surgery in the 1960s is a good illustration of such a repertoire. This fatwa will be discussed in one of our future podcasts, hopefully.
Wow, there is a lot. Thank you. So from what I understand so far, that these three barriers to collaboration, which you have clearly explained, have resulted in several drawbacks. First, traditional scholarship and the majority of ordinary Muslims have not yet engaged in the current discussions on sexuality and gender diversity in Islam. and also no productive dialogue between Muslim reformists and traditional scholars on these issues have yet to be held. In addition, ordinary Muslims have not been granted an opportunity to understandably hear alternative voices of Islam on sexuality and gender diversity, which are more accepting or tolerant of their identities.
Exactly. To avoid the above negative outcome, I suggest the pursuit of an alternative approach in our discussion. That is to follow a non-patriarchal reading of Islamic legal tradition through the Islamic paradigm of ijtihad. So I am confident that exercising this paradigm of ijtihad is a more plausible or effective way of fostering a successful dialogue between the majority of Muslim jurists who are traditional and the reformist scholars. Again, I would like to repeat that, as a matter of fact, academic studies on new topics concerning sexuality and gender diversity, such as homosexuality, transgenderism, and homosexuality, aim, after all, to support Muslim LGBTQI plus individuals and activists for more Islamic acceptance or tolerance towards Muslim individuals who identify as members of gender or sexual minority groups. This goal can be more likely fulfilled via a language and a methodology which are known to the traditional ulama. Whether we like it or not, the ulama have authority within Muslim societies and among grassroots Muslims. They are respected by ordinary Muslims who follow Islamic laws, as well as within the state authorities of Muslim societies. So consequently, they are most likely to be heard, listened to, and followed. If this is the case, then the reformists or feminists who conduct research in the field of Islam and sexual diversity inevitably must initiate dialogues with them. Our discussion is principally an endeavor to pursue such a dialogue by exploring the discursive spaces for debating and defending sexual and gender diversity in the modern Islamic legal or hermeneutical context. Therefore, the results of our discussion, I hope, may empower Muslim LGBTQI plus individuals who choose to be faithful both to their gender and sexuality and to their religious beliefs. So the outcomes of the present debates can also be employed by Muslim individuals who are engaged in activism to negotiate Islamic acceptance or tolerance towards LGBTQI plus individuals within the ulama. In addition, it also helps families of LGBTQI plus individuals and Muslim communities at large to better understand their situation and tolerate or accept them.
You mentioned ijtihad, or the Islamic paradigm of ijtihad, as a way in which modern scholars can open a dialogue with traditional and neo-traditional Muslim scholars. Could you please provide the audience with a bit of elaboration on this point?
Yes, ijtihad is deemed to be the method or tool that Muslim scholars often use to dive into primary revelational sources in order to infer Islamic legal or ethical approaches on any given issue. It is a pretty much compound concept and methodology, so it is not possible to unpack all aspects of ijtihad in this program. I do, however, hope we get a chance to discuss this issue on other occasions. That being said, just to briefly explain, there are various conceptions of ijtihad in Muslim scholarship. Three of them are regarded to be more accepted. A, ijtihad as a way to draw on personal opinion or right or legal analogy, qiyas, for those cases that are not covered by the Quran or Sunnah. And I mentioned previously that the Sunnah means the sayings, deeds, and endorsements of the Prophet Muhammad in Sunni legal schools, and of the Prophet Muhammad, his daughter Fatima, and the 12 Imams in Shia legal school. B, ijtihad as an exhaustion, istifraq al-wus' in Arabic, of a jurist's endeavor to drive an uncertain opinion regarding a legal ruling. And finally, ijtihad as a method that jurists can exert to definitely obtain or justifiably drive a legal ruling from reliable sources. The concept of ijtihad, in fact, are contested by various Muslim legal schools. For example, the Imami or Shia scholars refute the first use of ijtihad, and while some hold the second meaning, namely driving uncertain opinions, as a reliable way of understanding Islamic law, contemporary Shia scholars often rely on the third meaning. On the other hand, the first and second meaning of ijtihad are often accepted by Sunni scholars. However, what is more significant is that ijtihad in any of the above mentioned meanings is a technical, legal, or hermeneutical process to understand Islamic ruling. So one must master various fields of knowledge and attain several qualifications and skills to be called as a mujtahid.
Can you address these qualifications? Like, what are they?
Again, it is a difficult job to address or even allude to all of the qualifications here. But again, briefly explain, one needs to master the Arabic lexicon and philology, ilm al-lugha, and thus be able to understand the origins, structures, and evolution of Arabic vocabulary. They should also learn morphology, ilm al-tasrif, so they can determine the divisions and forms of individual words, particularly conjugations of verbs and pronouns. So mujtahid also should learn Arabic syntax and nahw to distinguish the structures of Arabic sentences in terms of inflection, i'rab, as they call it. Also, they are required to master legal theory, usul al-fiqh, which is largely perceived as the most important tool of ijtihad, without which a mujtahid cannot begin to practice ijtihad. The technique of biographical evaluation, namely ilm al-rijal, literally means science of men, of the individuals who transmitted ahadith, is another field of knowledge that is necessary for ijtihad. And the purpose of ilm al-rijal, in fact, is to explore the reliability of the hadith reports through evaluation of the characters of the transmitters. And in addition, a mujtahid must be highly knowledgeable about the typology of ahadith, tradition or ahadith, and be also able to comprehend and evaluate the credibility of various types of hadith, called ilm al-diraya. But let us stop here and do not make it too complicated for our audience.
Do you then mean that understanding Islamic texts only concerns specific scholars and not all Muslims? In other words, other Muslims are not allowed to interpret the Quran and the Sunnah?
Oh, it's a tricky point. Don't get me wrong. Of course, every Muslim, and in my view, every human is potentially able to interpret Islamic texts, because understanding of Islam has not been limited to some privileged individuals, groups, or institutions. What I'm trying to say is that anyone can interpret Islamic text if they obtain the qualifications mentioned above. This is because, for example, the Quran or Sunnah are originally delivered in Arabic, and no translation of them has authoritative force according to the consensus of Muslims. Therefore, if you wish to understand these texts, whether you like it or not, you must master Arabic rules or to discern reliable Sunnah from unreliable ones. You have no choice but to know ilm al-rijal and ilm al-hadith, or to be able to derive an authentic connotation of the Islamic textual revelation. You need to educate yourself about those legal hermeneutical rules which are appropriate for the interpretation of such texts.
Thank you. I really like, on a personal level, the last additional explanation that every Muslim can and should interpret the Quran and the Sunnah, and that Muslims are encouraged to build their own relationship with the Quran, with the word of God, so they can build their own relationship with Allah and the tradition of Islam. It's really beautiful and empowering every Muslim if they want to go on this path of qualification. But we'll end our conversation there. This is really amazing and really exciting. Thank you so much, Mardad, for this conversation. And thank you to everyone for listening. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Yeah, thanks to you as well for facilitating the debate and the podcast.